Tēnā koutou katoa, ko Tauhara te maunga, ko Taupo Nui a Tia te moana, ko Stu Hutchings toko ingoa, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Hi everyone, so many apologies for not being able to be physically present with you today. I guess this is biosecurity in action. I spent the last 2 or 3 days in Wellington, and but can assure everybody, well, I'm trying to assure everybody that I wasn't there over the weekend, and certainly haven't visited any of the places of interest that are creating some turmoil in the city at the moment. However, MPI has a policy that anything other than essential travel is not able to happen. So now I'm happily ensconced back in the Mount Maunganui, and speaking to you from there. I'd also like to send apologies from Penny Nelson. She and I were supposed to be co-presenting this paper in the initial iteration, but unfortunately she was unable to join with us today. So the topic that I've been asked to talk to you about is trends affecting biosecurity, and then some of the things that we can potentially try and do about that. So if we think about what are the key risks that we worry about with biosecurity, I guess one of the major ones that jumps up and hits us is those risks that would immediately stop or restrict our ability to export products. And there is an internationally agreed list of animal pests and diseases that fit into this category. And the obvious one that jumps to mind for everybody is foot and mouth disease, as this would immediately trigger a whole host of other countries to restrict our meat and dairy and animal exports. And potentially the data suggests that if we got foot and mouth disease, estimated that we could have $15 to $22 billion worth of impact on our GDP over the next 10 years or so, so pretty significant. There's a number of other pests and organisms that sit in this list, and one that I've certainly had personal experience with is fruit fly, when we had the response a couple of years ago in Auckland, and having been involved in the kiwi fruit industry, pests like that create a whole lot of nervousness from a market access perspective. So then we've got those organisms that can threaten our taonga species or natural ecosystems. And the obvious one that everybody's aware about there is kauri dieback and myrtle rust. And these are a concern because of the impact on our iconic species and in fact the whole of our ecosystems. But there's a vast number of insects and fungi and bacteria and plant viruses that threaten our native biodiversity. So we need to always be thinking about this, because often what happens is people focus their interest around those that are going to impact our primary sector productivity without thinking about what could actually happen in the native estate. Unfortunately, there's very little scientific information about most of these risks, because most of the organisms that are potential threats there are not pests in their home environment. So it's very difficult to work out what would actually happen should they come here. So if we think about those pests that could harm our primary sector productivity, an example there is something like Mycoplasma bovis, but also brown marmorated stink bug, which is a hitchhiker pest, as I'm sure you're all aware of, threatens over 300 species of plants, and is something that we've been a huge amount of effort to try and prevent by focusing our efforts offshore, so that we don't have to deal with this either at the border or post-border. It's been really successful, so focus on identifying those countries that have high levels of risk, and then working very diligently to try and manage that risk before it leaves that country of origin. So with that one, the cost to the economy is estimated at being potentially about 3.6 billion over 20 years, so of major concern there. Then if we think about those that affect our human health and well-being, so the zoonotic diseases. So our biosecurity system focuses on the zoonotic component, but if it becomes a human-to-human spread, like COVID, then that's something where the accountability shifts across to the Ministry of Health. The final thing that I guess that keeps us up at night is those that are already here in New Zealand and are causing harm. And the ones that I've certainly had a focus on in my previous life with Osprey were possums, because of their activity as a vector for spreading bovine TB, but also stoats, weasels, rats, just to name a few of those, and thinking about endemic diseases that are here like salmonella. We're currently dealing in a response there, as you would have heard in the media, with relationship with the poultry industry. There's a whole host of weeds and aquatic pests that are also of significance there. So New Zealand doesn't have a top 5 per se that we focus on with this, as many overseas countries do actually try and enumerate the top number. We more think about what is the likelihood of something actually being able to get into the country and establishing, and then what the potential impact that would be. So that's how we focus our key risk activity going forward. But our risks are changing, and the whole environment in the world is changing, and this is something that we're finding that we have to be really adaptive about. Some of the key ones, obviously, that we're facing at the moment is around trade and our international relationships. And there's always a tension, always this balance that we must have between risk management and the drive for growth in New Zealand that requires, or people desire, or industries desire, to bring in new germplasms, more products being imported, more mechanisms for import, and styles of commerce. And e-commerce is certainly a pathway that's constantly changing and growing there. So it's something with biosecurity that often in Biosecurity New Zealand we debate quite often is the fact that trade is a key driver for New Zealand, but often when we're focusing entirely around biosecurity, we're focused on risk management, and there are those that would like to have zero risk. And certainly when you talk to members of the public, they just say, well, why don't you just stop everything at the border? Whereas, of course, we have to be able to facilitate New Zealand's ability to have our economy survive. And if we look at the primary sector, you know, it's been looked to help us recover post-COVID. And so the horticultural industry, especially with our strategy around Fit for a Better World, has been looking to facilitate our growth there. With travel, I mean, if you think, and you're all aware that pre-COVID, travel was just starting to become such a fundamental component of everybody's daily life. You know, people traveling internationally, more products and equipment and anything really was able to, the ability to move it from A to B just didn't seem to be an impediment. And I certainly feel that that climate has changed significantly with COVID. At the KPMG agribusiness agenda that was released last week, there was a really interesting point made in there, which was, of course, in New Zealand, we take this for granted, our ability to move around our country and do business, albeit somewhat restricted. But what we've got to think about in the international perspective is that a whole lot of other countries don't have that luxury. So we've got to be very careful about assuming that our paradigm is the same as what others have internationally. So the importance of communication and understanding of our markets and risks is a key one. The environmental factors are pretty huge, and there's a number of those, and I won't go through them all, but changing temperatures with climate change is an obvious one there. As we get increasing temperatures with global warming, then the risks for biosecurity change, especially around the concept of changing land use as it becomes more accessible for some types of land use to become a bigger driver than others. And what we are seeing is change towards more horticultural inputs in some areas and changing away from farming or dairy type. So water use is a really significant one there, not only quantity of water use and drought and restrictions around that, but also the quality of water and impacts of what we do with that water. So it's something that can certainly have a huge impact on biosecurity. Water or lack of water can lead to stresses to plants and animals, and that can lead to increases in susceptibility. Other environmental factors that we often don't think about is we've got a changing political landscape. So we've got drivers, very strong drivers at the moment for changes in social structure and infrastructure development, and all of those can have flow-on impacts into the risks that we face. And the final one, I guess, to think about is the regulatory environment. So we've currently got the Biosecurity Act under review, and that's a massive opportunity for us to be able to change the perspective or the way we think about how we manage biosecurity in New Zealand and shape the future for how that gets managed and how we do deal with those risks. But there's other regulatory environment changes that we deal with as well. So the change in agrochemical use, the change in social license around those, and certainly that can have an impact when we're thinking about treatments or post-border aspects of biosecurity and the whole concept of the consumer-driven approach to the use of agrochemicals. The biggest one, I guess, we've got to think about is COVID-19 and the change in risks that that's created for biosecurity. The obvious ones there is everybody says, well, it must be okay because our air passenger numbers and cruise ship numbers have just plummeted. So estimates of up until the bubble opened, down by 95% and no cruise ships coming in at all. However, we've got to also think that with the bubble increase, we've got things that happen like Wellington, as I've talked about yesterday, where suddenly we are being thrust into a situation where the environment changes around that. So with the changes in those passenger travel, there's also quite a lot of changing that we need to do in thinking about how we manage this at the border. So there's changes in patterns and behaviours associated with different styles of travel or different countries coming. So we have to recalibrate how we target our risk assessment at the border and all of the pathways. It's been very interesting with the increase in e-commerce, which has gone up about 20%, and that tends to have replaced some of the mail pathway. So that's down by 30% because what's happening is a lot of the e-commerce is driving the mail system into the cargo pathway rather than into the mail pathway. So that means we've got to change our focus and where we put our efforts in terms of border staff. So if we think about some of the lessons that we have learned out of COVID, but also the responses that we've been dealing with, like Mycoplasma bovis, I guess the biggest one that constantly we think about and get reminded is that we are in the biggest biosecurity response that we can possibly have. So that increases the public's general understanding about what biosecurity means. And a really good example about that is just things like quarantine, social distancing, basic hygiene, which have then had a massive impact on other aspects of public health, so decrease in influenza and transmission of other diseases. So the other aspect of that is the concept of thinking about layers of defence, and we can certainly use this messaging in biosecurity, is that it's not just a single aspect of the biosecurity system that reduces our risk factors like the one that everybody tends to point towards, which is the border, but it's actually a multiple set of layers across that system. So thinking about something like the brown marmorated stink bug, the real effort has to happen offshore, because if we can reduce the risks associated with that, then the numbers of potential interceptions that are going to happen at the border get reduced, and we've certainly seen that over the last year. And then, of course, the risks associated with post-border management of responses is decreased as well. So thinking about the concepts as layers of defence is one that is really sensible. So also a big part of this is understanding the implications of our decisions. So so often when it is only focused on a particular part of the biosecurity system, then the resultant decision that occurs is only focused on that part, rather than trying to ensure that our decision makers are thinking from a system perspective, so that all of the time, how will this impact on the wider system for biosecurity? And the real key lesson that we've learned, especially out of Mycoplasma bovis, is that it's really important that we have simple, honest, clear and timely communication to the public and the decision makers. And I think this also flows over to the messaging that we have out of science. When I was with kiwifruit vine health, and we did a lot of research every year into PSA, but also other biosecurity risks, a real focus that we always tried to have is when the research finished, what does this mean? What's the message that we're going to take out of this work? How are we actually going to change behaviours as a result of this piece of work, so that we're not just focusing on science for science sake, but what it means in terms of changing those behaviours as a consequence of that. So if we think about the system approach, I've used this diagram before, and although I don't particularly like it in terms of how it does describe the system, it is good with that concept of offshore having a large amount of risk. And then rather than us thinking about the system as being a wall that stops things, that it's a series of nets where each time you activate a part of that system, you're acting to catch a degree of that risk. And so by the time we do get through into the post-border space, and we're using surveillance and incursion investigation, building readiness plans, or having to do responses or move into long-term recovery or pest management, the risk associated has been hugely reduced by having that system approach. So we have some key outcomes that we try and drive in Biosecurity New Zealand, and the first one of those is that our biosecurity system is stronger, including our own business processes. So this is having excellence within the work that we do as an organisation, that our imports and exports are key to our markets and that they contribute to New Zealand's growth and prosperity. So this picks up that point I had at the beginning of my talk, that the impact of harmful pests and diseases in New Zealand is able to be reduced by how we use our biosecurity system. And then the final one, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, the kōtātau process, that we're involving 5 million New Zealanders in thinking about biosecurity. And how do we actually create that behaviour change where everybody doesn't think that it's the government's problem or it's the problem at the border, but that everybody can have a part to play in managing their own biosecurity risk? And the creation of concepts like on-farm biosecurity risk management plans and on-orchard biosecurity risk management plans are a fundamental part of that. So everybody thinking about their own farm or their own orchard as a biosecurity unit, and that they can actually try and reduce the risk by having some key processes in there. And that's where we draw on those lessons out of things like COVID, so that you can have that system approach and think about things like basic hygiene can have a direct impact in reducing the risk or reducing disease should it come along. So what are the opportunities that we can think about moving forward that comes out of all of this? So obviously the major one there is using COVID-19 and the lessons that we've had out of that to increase our biosecurity literacy in New Zealand. There's a whole lot in the technology space, and I'm guessing that as part of this conference, there's been a lot of discussion about where technology can help drive through science effort to improve our ability to manage biosecurity risk. So in budget 2021, there was $8.9 million invested to try and develop advanced screening technology at the border. So purchasing 3D scanners and developing data screening system to identify potential risk goods before they arrive here. So in the first scanner for that's been installed at Auckland's International Mail Centre by the end of this year, once that mail centre is up and running. Or concepts like the Bug, or what's called the Bug, which is a new inspection robot for clearing imported vehicles. So it looks like a bit of an all-terrain skateboard, but it can easily get under cars, and it comes with a couple of cameras, and one of them which has thermal imaging device, so can help detect insects. A key one obviously is the fundamental ability to share data and have technology that's able to utilise data in a way that can allow good analytics and risk management to occur. And for me, this is a major gap. It's something that we've talked about for a long period of time, and yet we don't seem to be able to bridge that gap and start the process of how can we fundamentally store, utilise, share and analyse the data that we have. We think about pathway approaches is an opportunity. So often our biosecurity effort is focused at the single organism or the single pest, rather than thinking about what are the pathways by which we can manage the risk. And one of the experiences I have had when I was at Kiwifruit Vine Health is the beginning of creation of a pathway management plan, which is one of the instruments under the Biosecurity Act. And the concept there is again, in that post-border space, having our orchardists being able to consider what are the risks for biosecurity coming onto their orchard and how do they manage those. So risks like soil, risks like plant material moving around, risks like contractors coming onto the property. So risks like the types of composting that they're using. And so how to actually assess those risks and try and fundamentally manage or reduce them at the orchard level, so that should we get an incursion, they're at that next stage of preparedness and are thinking about this as part of their daily activity. Part of the concepts there is trying to embed biosecurity into people's mindset, much the same way as we've got health and safety embedded into the mindset through a major change behaviour process. So the collaboration within and across our system framework is a really key important one here. It's where we've got to ensure that we've got all of our stakeholders that are working in the biosecurity space thinking about how that they can work in a way that doesn't mean that we're getting parallel stuff going on within silos. And a big part of my role, the Chief Biosecurity Officer, is to start thinking and driving that thinking around a system approach to it. So I'm very conscious that we've got work going on in regional councils around regional pest management plans, work going on within DOC, work going on within industry, work going on within research frameworks, work going on within individual sectors. And yet often none of those actually start to join up or thinking about how that they can be aware of what's going on in each other's space, but better still collaborating or leveraging off that work. The final one there is around the legislative change, and that comes back to the opportunities that we might gain out of the Biosecurity Act review and trying to think about how we can take a more system approach to what we do there. So the final point I want to visit on is around the concept of Fit for a Better World. So this was a plan that was released by the government in 2020, and I'm sure many of you are aware of. The aim there was to boost the primary sector export earnings by 44 billion over the next decade, while protecting the environment and trying to grow jobs. So, and this has been really a vital plan post-COVID, and has been looking to the horticultural sector especially to try and achieve some of this growth. And this is by accelerating access to and commercialisation of high-value plant varieties and products, and delivery of small-scale water storage solutions, which can then mitigate the drought risk, incentivising investment in land use changes to high-value horticultural crops. So it's also aimed around improving market access and aligning our research and innovation activities to help drive these change. Another key aspect of the Fit for a Better World is around the sustainability component. So supporting New Zealand's journey to low carbon emissions, low emissions economy by reducing biogenic methane to 24 to 47% below the 2017 levels by 2050, and include 10% below 2017 levels by 2030. And also thinking about restoring New Zealand's freshwater to a healthy state within a single generation. The final one there around the inclusiveness is the drive towards employing more Kiwis in the primary industry sector.